Welcome, Gary. Gary and I both came from the People's Republic of Cambridge, if you've ever heard of it. And there were, locally, there were two types of desegregation plans. There was an involuntary desegregation plan in Boston and a voluntary desegregation plan in Cambridge. Could you just opine a little bit about what did and did not work about both of those plans and whether there was any differentiation because one was voluntary and one was involuntary?
Boston in the early 1970s was found to be guilty of intentionally segregating African American students. The evidence was incontrovertible. They segregated the housing, they discriminated in the schools, they designed and operated many aspects of their school district in a way that was intentionally segregated. And they were ordered to come up with a remedy. Unlike almost every other big city in the United States, they just totally defied the court. Under the leadership of Louise Day Hicks and others, they just polarized the city in the most profound way. And many of the elected officials virtually risked going to jail in contempt of the court. And they aroused tremendous hatred in the city. And had boiled over into violence when they desegregated South Boston High School. Now, Boston is a very small city compared to Western cities. It was really one of the first cities in the United States cut off by independent suburbs. When we studied the metropolitan area in a whole series of studies in the early 2000 period, Boston had only 2% of the white students in the metro. 98% of them were living in the suburbs. It's a very small central city surrounded by a vast suburban ring. So the whites who were left in Boston when the desegregation order came down were mostly not middle-class people. They were mostly working-class folks. And they were it was a highly segregated and racially polarized city. And basically the plan that was devised it was devised by the state, I believe, because the local people wouldn't refuse to devise any plan of their own. The plan that was devised sent white kids into nearby very poor black areas and black kids into a very hostile white ethnic area in South Boston. And violence erupted in South Boston High School. And that became a national cause célèbre. There was more coverage of that one high school than of all the other cities in the United States that were desegregating at that period, none of which had the same experience. There's a lot of very successful mandatory desegregation plans in the country. Boston was a total failure. Boston was a total failure in terms of its leadership, in its planning, in terms of its execution, and in terms of the fact that it only had a very small part of the urban area included in the desegregation plan. So many people have overgeneralized from Boston to say you can't do urban desegregation. Urban and metropolitan-wide mandatory desegregation have worked very well in lots of cities. There were big failures in Boston, but interestingly in Boston, when the court left and they could have gone back to neighborhood schools, they still haven't, because people had basically come to the point where they were choosing, most people in Boston were choosing as their preference some school outside their neighborhood. So Boston still hasn't returned to neighborhood schools. Tony Lucas, who wrote the famous book about the failure of the Boston desegregation plan, came to Harvard and said he thinks he made a mistake in analyzing the plan that actually did more good than ill for Boston. But it was the worst plan, and almost every other city in the country that was required to desegregate in a mandatory way decided that they did not want to be like Boston. And none of the rest of them ever were like Boston in terms of the violence that developed. So Cambridge was a very different situation. Actually, the people in Cambridge, when they were developing the plan, came out to talk to me. I was at the University of Illinois. The school superintendent and so forth, and made a secret trip out to talk. And they came up with a plan called controlled choice, which is choice, but it's controlled. You can choose as long as you end up in an integrated school. You can't choose to go to a segregated school. And in Cambridge is a small city. very dense but small. And it only has one high school, so there was no high school to desegregate. There was no South Boston there. So they were very fortunate in that level, because high schools were the most difficult to desegregate. If you've been raised in segregation for 8 years and your parents are all prejudiced, when you bring you together in high school, it's really tough. So Cambridge came up with this controlled choice plan, and it implemented it fairly well, and it maintained a high level of racial integration, although it didn't maintain social class integration very well. Cambridge is a community of extreme wealth and extreme poverty, and 1/6 of the housing units in Cambridge are subsidized. So you have not only race differences, but class differences that are very deep. And there's a lot of segregation among schools and within schools in Cambridge that wasn't addressed very well. But overall, they never had any big problem. And we surveyed all the students in the junior year in high school in Cambridge and found that Black and Latino and Asian and white students felt very positively about their experience in interracial terms. And we actually had a meeting with the president, with the city, the mayor of the city and the school board superintendent and so forth, and the mayor stood up and he said, you know, he said, this is what we always wanted to happen in our city. And they made it happen to some extent, but they had a lot of unfinished work to do. But they're right across the river from each other, and one of them was a catastrophe and the other one was a reasonably significant success that could have created the basis for a bigger success if it had gone further.
All right, great.
For more information, visit hightechhigh.org.